like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for hosting me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. So you and I have been kind of batting around an idea because we got a lot of good feedback on our recent few episodes on Lewis, particularly as regards the problem of evil. And one of the things that kind of jostled loose in my brain was the concept of the serial killer, right? The mass murderer, because it seems to be sort of done, right? We don't have them anymore as, kind of new ongoing media figures. And there's some changes in law enforcement and reporting that might account for that. But, the heyday of the American serial killer, that media sensation is a really interesting thing. Obviously, we have precedent before humans like gory, nasty stories. So, for instance, right, you have Sawney Bean, I don't know how you say it, right, the mythical Scottish cannibal, right, whose clan allegedly killed 1,000 people and ate them back in the 16th century. So you have things like that, right? People like tall tales. But, the serial killer as a cultural figure is something very different than that. Now, albeit in the modern day, that kind of like satanic figure has been replaced. We have, the mass shooter. And there's an interesting transition there, right? In the 90s, you have first Columbine, then the DC sniper, which is sort of this pivot point, one to the other. And so, obviously, Thomas, you have, a certain amount of interest in this topic. And I'm curious if you want to just start off from there.
Yeah, definitely. And, to be clear, as a caveat, and mind you, I'm not concerned with complying with bougie moral strictures at all. Okay, but I also don't want people thinking that I'm glorifying evil people and evil deeds or something. And I got a lot of heat when I hosted Nico Clow on my pod. I frankly, I just think he's an interesting guy. Okay. I'm not some serial killer fanboy, but also it's an important topic in terms of zeitgeist and interpreting, apocalyptic sociological phenomenon. And obviously because Nico was willing to provide his testimony on that in a basically honest capacity. I just wanted to clarify that's where a lot of my interest in this subject derives from. The last thing I want to do is present this kind of thing and these kinds of awful deeds and the awful people who commit them as cool. But, serial murder, it's kind of been memory hold, and such that it isn't. There's a basic dishonesty around the conversation, even among people who lived through the era. Like, I noticed increasingly there's this idea that, all this concern about these kinds of bizarre crimes, that was all just sort of that was kind of within the penumbra of satanic panic, as it's called, and none of this was real. It was just legacy media capping to promote panic and draw viewership, and these kind of moral majority types were, the way they were dealing with some of these punctuated shocks of modernity, that were emergent from really the 60s onward, is, they were just kind of creating these like sinister mythologies around it. That's not really true. This was a very real thing. Like you could feel it. I made the point, it might have been, It might have been on our friend Dimes's pod a year or so back. I kind of liked that movie, The Black Phone, with Ethan Hawke. There's a hokey supernatural kind of plot device I thought was stupid, but the setting is kind of these kids in this like Pacific Northwest town, and there's this pederast serial killer, and he's just like grabbing kids. So these like junior high school age kids, it just kind of casts this like darkness over their lives, because that like there's predators out there, and you could fall victim to one of them and just like not be seen again. And that was a real thing. If you're a Gen Xer, you felt it. And you were afraid of adults for good reason. And this was way before the era like helicopter parenting and that bullshit. Like, you were basically on your own. You had to learn essentially if you got a bad feeling about an adult, to do what you had to do to defend yourself or escape the situation. But bringing it back, serial murder is a crime that really kind of became facilitated by highway culture and kind of the anonymity of urbanization. And that's why Los Angeles was really kind of this serial killer heartland, because nobody was really from there, outside of these hoods that had deep roots and things like that. There was kind of a morally loose sensibility in comparative terms. There was a lot of young people who were kind of out and about and supervised and wouldn't be reported missing. There's a lot of marginal people. But this kind of hunting other humans to get off, literally, that's something that was very much bound up with the zeitgeist. And, it's a very personal crime, and it's a very entitled crime. And to your point, like, the mass shooter, he comes from a very different place psychically and conceptually, and why he does the things he does. And I realized the first true mass shooting was Charles Whitman's rampage at the University of Texas. For those who don't know, he climbed up a bell tower and began sniping at people. And it was 1966. Somebody will correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But, and famously, there's the macabre reference in Full Metal Jacket, the unhinged gunnery sergeant, drill instructor. He says that, like, Charles Whitman was a great shot, and he was on target because he learned to shoot, damn it, in the United States Marines. But, Whitman, so, I mean, I'm not suggesting that mass shootings never happened before, but, it was rare. And, it's very much a 21st century crime, in my opinion, and, there was weird things in the zeitgeist, now whether that was like a self-fulfilling prophecy or like art imitates life, imitates art, whether I'll accept that, satanic panic was a real thing, but the media basically confabulated it into a real phenomenon that kind of had a formative effect on the impulses and acts of these profoundly disturbed people. But it was real. People were doing these things. Like people like Richard Ramirez, people like the Chicago Ripper crew, people like those teenagers who slaughtered their friend in Missouri at in Grand Junction. They believed they were doing these things for cultic reasons. So, like, whether you and I or everybody else thinks that's stupid is incidental. That's what they were intending to do, and there was very strange phenomena of a symbolic psychological nature in the culture. Like I said, you could feel it, and I was I grew up in a super zip 20 minutes north of downtown Chicago. Like I wasn't out in the sticks or something. I'm not putting down people from small towns at all. What I'm saying is that the cliche is like, oh well, even where this stuff, might have had some legs in terms of real world expression, it was just, in what's derisively called flyover country, and where people are encumbered by this kind of primitive Baptist religiosity. Okay, I was in a place that was the opposite of that. Okay, and I could tell you this was a real thing. So just kind of like as an introductory, framing device, I just wanted to get that out there.
Well, and you mentioned highway culture, the ability to rapidly move wherever you wanted, and the appearance of unmoored people. You see this in the history of California. After, the Summer of Love, you have all of these young people, some of whom went back to have relatively normal lives and become, the most irritating people the world has ever seen. But others of them basically got spit up and shoot out, right? They became junkies. They joined all of these cults in Jonestown, the Manson family, pick your poison. And with that, you have these transient people who have no roots, who are, in and out of town, and also, the ability for predators to go after them. But I think another relevant part of this is effectively broadcast news, televised news, and turning these things into these great hunts. Because look, don't get me wrong, criminals have always enjoyed a certain level of celebrity. Look at Victorian newspapers, look at our own history of newspapers. Criminals have always been, to some degree or another, great news. They've sold well. But it seems as if, and actually you even see this in something like Kaczynski, right? The months-long search for the blank blank killer, the kind of taunting back and forth, and the fame associated with that seemed to be a significant factor in promoting that criminal tendency.
Oh, 100%. And something too that must be acknowledged, because this is a lesser included phenomena. The phenomena of serial murder, vis-a-vis what I'm about to describe. There was an epidemic of violence that nobody can really explain from about 1964, 65 until the later 90s. And then by the turn of the millennium, it had basically abated, and nobody can explain this. And famously, in like the Kitty Genovese case, which has become like apocryphal, like Kitty Genovese was this young single lady in the big city, and she was attacked and murdered, as the story goes, in broad daylight. And as she was screaming for help, like nobody helped her and nobody even called the police. It's more nuanced than that. But, and in that old movie, The Watchmen, based on the graphic novel property, there's the one masked vigilante, who's kind of like the anti-hero protag. And he's describing how he became a vigilante because he lived in like in the neighborhood where that happened, and he realized that like the social contract was crumbling or whatever. So apocryphal as that is, it was right around that time, 64, 65, 66, the genuine epidemic of violence jumped off. And there's the Freakonomics explanation, which I think is nonsense. It's a perfect example of lying with numbers. These guys claim that like, oh, well, it was the baby boom and all these military age males who were presumably, mired in structural poverty, who were just acting out. And then, Roe v. Wade, it averted, an ongoing tragedy of the commons, on grounds that presumably, these unwanted babies were aborted. in lieu of being brought into these troubled circumstances and things, which is nonsense. Then there's other, you'll find like Russell Kirk types in the era, suggesting, well, this is like symptomatic of godlessness and alienation, which is true. I mean, I'm not saying that's not true, but that's not an adequate explanation. And then basically, like, as abruptly as it started, it just stopped. And I make the point to people again and again that the early 90s were incredibly violent in a way that I don't think younger people really understand. When I first got on social media, like around the end of 2020, like, I remember one of the first movies I reviewed was Kids, from 1995. That's the Larry Clark movie, which is it's almost quasi-pornographic. And Clark is kind of a disturbed guy. But I maintain that movie is a legit snapshot of the early 90s. There was released in 95, it was shot in 93, 94. And like the scene where the skater kids, they stomp that hood rat who's trying to bully them, like, presumably to death. That wasn't nonsense. That kind of stuff happened, and there was no internet. There, like, media culture was totally different. And if you were a young person, the setting for your life was out of doors, or at concert venues, or at skate parks, or at kind of run down shopping malls, and the kind of glorification of gangster culture, like above and beyond what's remotely normal, was a real thing, and that was kind of the final destructive, sort of cyclical expression of the phenomenon I'm talking about. And so serial murder very much was part of that. And there was a queasy sexualization in the culture. I mean, that's not just something that Andrea Dworkin type feminists would talk about. There was a kind of casualness about treating females very roughly. I'd see it, and that was part of it, because if a girl was viewed as being kind of loose, people, there was a kind of sense of like, well, she's carrying on with the wrong kinds of guys, and she's opening her legs for people she shouldn't be. So if something bad happens to her, well, then she kind of deserves it. And that was a real thing. So it wasn't like today where there's this kind of hypersensitivity to even like innocuous conduct, between of a man toward, of a young guy towards the fair sex. Like, there's none of that. So there was the combination of those things, like the violence epidemic, this kind of casual violence in the culture, this kind of casual perverse sexuality that was like inundating everything in ways both subliminal and very overt. And the fact that everybody was literally like living their lives out of doors. I think it was kind of like a perfect storm of shit. And to your point you raised a minute ago about the culture of Southern California, people don't realize this, I think. And, my folks were from there, and I spent about half my early life in the 80s, like, in Los Angeles. Los Angeles and SoCal generally was ground zero for religious revivalism. Like, holy rollers were all in Southern California. There was half a dozen like crazy mega church type radio stations. It was everywhere. It was like baked into the culture. And that's why shit like Scientology, that's why these crazy, kind of new age cults, that's why, like, the People's Temple. I realized that Jim Jones's whole cult was up in the Bay Area. But the point is, like, cultism and a kind of cultic religiosity of a very zealous and strange sort that is baked into the California sociology. Like California is not this like rabidly secular place, whatever people think. But yeah, I'll give it back to you, man. I realized that was quite long.
Well, you still see the same thing. Look at megachurch pastor Ed McManus, who I think is out of Malibu.
Right.
That's still alive, right? It's still there. It's kind of taken the form of the watered down Christianity you and I were talking about earlier with Lewis. It is stripped of a lot of its, I guess, doctrine, but it's still there. I think that one of the things that we've been talking about here is that there was sort of this lag on cultural degradation in certain ways. And I'm not trying to be a pearl clutching conservative here, but the existing social order had been broken in several ways. The relationship between men and women, the relationship between people and their parents, people and where they live, and people and their place of work had all been majorly shifted. Obviously, we had entered a new form of government. We were, FDR's republic. And with that came a number of, earth-shaking social changes. So you mentioned earlier, and again, I didn't live through this, but I can see it, the ways in which the relation between the sexes changed. So the thing is, right, you have this kind of multiple waves of feminism. And the combination of women entering the workforce, the highway system, and birth control mixed with a massive social change about what was deemed to be acceptable behavior and not. And again, people have always done similar things. I'm not trying to present the past as this kind of perfect bastion of morality, but there was socially acceptable behavior. And when all of that changes, it's very often you get this kind of initial burst where, those new mores are restricted to the upper class, right? A relatively small number of people. And then when it goes mainstream, when it hits Gen Pop, it wreaks an immense amount of havoc, oftentimes in a way that's relatively difficult to track. Because, you'll watch something. The great example from the article Luxury Beliefs is, I can't remember the exact term. It was, pansexuality. This became kind of trendy and cool 10 to 15 years ago for women in the Ivy Leagues to say, I'm pansexual, which meant absolutely nothing, right? It was a way to gain, certain social points. And if you look at these women through their life, they acted exactly like their parents. But when that trickles down, when it hits people who are, to adopt a leftist framework, less privileged, less advantaged, right? They don't have the same, social safety nets. They don't have the same privilege, quote unquote. It wreaks havoc. And to me, it seems as if this is multiple things at once, all hitting. You have this massive social change, and to give the Freakonomics guy some credit, you do have a population boom, and all of those at once create this kind of tinder box of violence. Now, let alone we have, which admittedly is something different, the rise in urban crime and violence. You look at someone like, who was that guy who shot those teenagers on the New York subway? Getz?
Bernie Getz.
Yeah. You have a case like that, which is, it indicates something different, but it's the same kind of mass endemic of violence.
Yeah, that's very true. And something I'll also add, and again, to be clear, I'm not suggesting anything bad about combat veterans, quite the contrary. And I got a perspective on this because my uncle Harold, who's my mom's half brother, he was a generation older than her, because like my paternal grandfather, he literally started a second family, and when he started my mom. But Harold, in my early life, had a huge impact on me, and I've written about him on social media. But Harold was at Tarawa, and then he became an LAPD sergeant, and he resigned in disgrace. he would for graft and brutality and a whole lot of shit. But Los Angeles. One of the reasons I find it so objectionable, these kinds of boomer truth, you know, these kinds of these people who promulgate these baby boomer myths like Oliver Stone does about like, America lost its innocence when Kennedy was killed. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Los Angeles was full of screwed up guys who still had a head full of war from the Pacific, trying to find their way, with often, and they were taking it out on their families and on strangers and on their ops on the street. And, this was a very real thing throughout the mid to late 20th century. And I'd argue, Vietnam, I think that it's a gross stereotype of the Vietnam psycho that's kind of faded into history, but I think it was a destructive trope, but it wasn't entirely fictitious. And Vietnam, the nature of modern combat, the peculiarities of deployment patterns, advances in, remedial measures and countermeasures that allowed people to survive with brain damage, what would have been catastrophic injuries. This really conspired to, create another layer of violent tendencies into the sociological paradigm. And William Bonin, who was one of many quote freeway killers, and this is something that's totally insane. Bonin was like a one-man death squad. He slaughtered dozens of young men and boys. He was a monster. John Wayne Gacy type of guy. At the same time he was doing that, the Hillside Stranglers were killing young women, and Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were doing the same thing the Hillside Stranglers were doing, and Randy Kraft, who's another homosexual serial killer. Like there's this whole like subculture of guys doing this. But Bonin, he'd received the Bronze Star with Valor Device at Nam. He was an Air Force gunner, who logged like hundreds of hours in heavy combat, and he was a war hero. And this wasn't a totally uncommon resume, not to be flippant, for a serial killer. A lot of these guys were losers, and obviously, like guys who were decorated war veterans were the minority and an outlier. But this wasn't some unheard of thing within the ranks of this rogues gallery. And I guarantee you that had something to do with, Bonin, according to him, and he ended up on death row when he became pretty candid about what he'd done. There's no reason to believe he'd committed homicide until he came back from Vietnam. And I refuse to believe that's an accident.
Yeah, and to that, there's in Vietnam, and obviously insurgencies are not new. The U.S. has fought a number of them, right? You have the Philippines. When did we fight the Bolos? Was that the Philippines? I can't remember. Obviously, there was some of that in the Second World War, but a mass mobilization where you were conscripting men to fight against, obviously, an organized force in the NBA, but also a civilian population. And you've spoken about the free fire zones and, the rationale behind that. So I'm not, looking to make some sort of, tired, trite point about the Vietnam War. But nonetheless, that sort of blurring the lines between civilians and combatants. It's not a stretch to see how that would, that could twist someone's psyche, if you see what I'm saying.
Well, scalp hunting too. Literally the performance metric of an attrition strategy is the body count. So you become a scalp hunter. it's not particularly easy to turn that off. But if you're somebody who's morally bent anyway, and you're encouraged to develop a taste for it, and not and there's an entire positive reinforcement mechanism, insinuated therein, that's courting catastrophe. And Nam also, I don't think people fully understand, in a conflict like World War II, or even in the trenches in World War One, you know, uh, enemy contact, there like weeks or even months would go by without enemy contact. And then when it happened, it was highly scaled, it was catastrophic, it was terrifying, but it was brief. And if you survived, there was a good chance that you wouldn't be subjected to those kinds of intense combat conditions again for the duration of deployment. In Nam, air mobility specifically, the ability changed everything. The ability to force enemy contact, and to locate the enemy, really across the entirety of the battle space, actual or prospective, and then initiate contact within, you know, minutes or hours. And that meant that if you were in the combat infantry or in combined arms, like Bonin was in support of combat infantry, in direct roles, that meant that basically over the 12 months you were in Nam, or 13 months against the Marines, over and over and over and over again, you're going to be making contact with the enemy, sometimes multiple times in one day. That's completely insane. And, again, too, this was before Kevlar, but body armor was better than it had been. And particularly guys in armored vehicles had better survival odds. So you'd have guys being blown up and enduring concussion industry injuries, um, you know, that lead to TBI. This was happening over and over again, and these guys were surviving and being sent back into combat. That was unprecedented. It's like all these things. And make no mistake, again, I'm not at all a military type, which should be clear to anybody. I like rock and roll and stuff, not like crew cut stuff. But I've got huge respect for the Vietnam era military, because I think they're punk rock and they were just cool. But also, many of them were just regular guys, but beyond that, I'm not throwing shade on them at all. But also, I'm not trying to confer an outsized significance on this particular variable. But it's something that can't be discounted. And the degree to which violence kind of informs the American psyche, I mean, to this day, but particularly, when mass conscription was the norm, that definitely played a part in the equation. And pivoting a bit too to the mass shooter thing, the degree to which too, the kind of stuff we're talking about, without getting into the horrible details, because that's lurid. The kind of stuff that serial killers did, it was axiomatically sexual. It was very personal. It was very, very rooted in a discrete psychological imperative towards a certain kind of gratification. That's very different than what mass shooters do. Unless you're talking about something that's truly politically driven, a counter value act of terrorism, which is a subject for another discussion. I believe that it should be clear to anybody, these mass shooters, they're trying to strike back at what they view as the social organism, or at society, or at some concrete iteration of, you know, society as they experience it. That's both very personal, but also kind of impersonal in in terms of eros, or in terms of the desire for some sort of sadistic experience. It's something very, very different, and I think that very much tracks with the 21st century zeitgeist in a way that would have been somewhat unintelligible even to totally maladapted people who had a lot of hostility towards, what they view as capital S society. And it's worth noting too that Whitman had a brain tumor, and the McDonald's shooting in 1984 in Southern California, which was a big deal, and that really upset people. And I was in California when it happened as a little kid, but that guy too was in treatment for schizophrenia. That's very different. I mean, that's distinguishable from what we're talking about. I just think that drawing the distinction, which I believe was one of the reasons why you wanted to address this topic, is important.
Yeah. So, and forgive me if I'm too far out over my skis here, but it seems relevant. The conflation of, shall we say, sexual paraphilia and identity, where it's, for instance, you have the transition between sodomy as an act, as a crime, and as a political identity. I am gay. I think is another relevant factor as well, where the pivot point of you as a person is your sexual expression and identity. Even earlier, right, when we were kind of joking about, libtarded women calling themselves pansexual, that is not necessarily a description of behavior. It is a statement of identity. And I think that placing Eros at the center of being, at the center of identity, I'm not going to say it's the sole determinant factor, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't related.
No, hugely. And specifically, I'm not suggesting that all serial killers are homosexuals or something, like, at all. But they are disproportionately represented. And there's an intrinsic violence to gay subculture. It's not like Will and Grace or whatever bougies think. And when I was living in Edgewater, which was something of a homo ghetto, I managed a gym there, and I got to know a lot of these guys fairly well because I saw them every day. And in the 90s and 2000s, when competitive bodybuilding was still very subcultural, a lot of those guys were very attracted and involved in it. So I got to know these guys reasonably well. They weren't people I hung out with, but they were part of my day-to-day world. And, there's an undercurrent of violence to not just the aesthetics that those people favor, but like what they find exciting and what they think distinguishes themselves from normies. And I think the movie Cruising, the William Friedkin movie, I think that's a great film. It's got some aspects of giallo. It's very much like a slasher movie. It's kind of a non-traditional police procedural. I think it's a great movie. It puts a lot of people off because the subject matter is queasy, and there's some pretty explicit scenes. I mean, nothing totally over the top and depraved, but there's some pretty explicit scenes of homosexual activity and stuff. But I think it's a great film, and it's a very true film, and without spoiling the plot for people who've not seen it and who desire to, the protag, the Al Pacino character, it's never clear, like, as he gets more insinuated into the subculture, it's not clear, like, who the killer is, because all those guys are into that stuff, and he himself is starting to feel that allure, not just towards homosexual behavior, but, towards the implicit violence of it, so it's not a guy like Bonin who, was not only habituated to violence anyway, because he was like a decorated Vietnam combat veteran, but it was very much into kind of like the gay subculture of cruising. It doesn't take much, I think, to step through into homicide as for something that, you want to experience as as some sort of penultimate erotic thrill, but then ultimately something you need to experience in order to feel sated. And like, don't get me wrong. Again, like there's plenty of these evil people whose victim profile is female, and they're obviously the majority. But these there's something when Ted Bundy, who was a liar, obviously, but the final interview he gave, some 12 hours before his execution, we were talking about his pornography addiction. There's this kind of Greek chorus of people saying like, "Oh, he's lying. He's just trying to justify what he did." I don't think they really understand what he was getting at. Like, first of all, hours away from the gallows, I think even like a piece of shit like Bundy, I think it's kind of a stretch to say that he was lying. Like, for the benefit of who? Like, secondly, pornography addiction's a real thing, and it does warp your view of females and of sexuality. And a true porn addict like Bundy was, who's morally deformed anyway, and who is got propensities towards paraphilic violence. I don't understand why it's hard for people to believe that pornography and the whole kind of porn subculture would shape his kind of conceptual prejudices in that regard. And almost without exception, these guys were into pornography. They were into prostitutes. They'd surround themselves with these kinds of women and with this kind of stimulus. And I mean, Bundy was significant, and one of the reasons I believe why there's such a fixation with them among normies, even like 50 years on, is because he took those fascinations, and instead of victimizing these unfortunate women who are on that hustle and who are involved in prostitution and stuff like that, he directed his violence towards normal middle class women who don't participate in that kind of thing, and that people found that both scary as well as unusual, and it is unusual.
I think that and I'm going to speak somewhat more metaphysically here, but from the outside looking in, it seems that homosexual culture is entirely built on personal gratification of any type to excess, right? That is the basis of it. You see this in the the extreme hypergamy, the drug culture, right, associated with it, around things like poppers and party drugs. And so the extension of that to not merely the sexual, but also the homicidal, there's a through line there. I think you're getting to something. But I want to use kind of like the last segment of the show to talk about, and you mentioned it earlier, the place of the serial killer in media, right, on film, because we haven't really seen the same thing with mass shooters for a number of reasons. There are a few attempts, but nothing even close to what we saw with serial killers. Now, is some of that the fact that cinema as an art form is incredibly degraded? Possibly. Is some of that it's somewhat less easy to make a compelling narrative about as sort of an anonymous random killer, right? Just looking to kind of strike out at society. Also possible. I know there's some cases like the elephant, I think, is one of them. But if we talked about serial killer movies, we'd be here all day. There are dozens of them. 7, Silence of the Lambs. But what degree do you think that that sort of entered the zeitgeist through film?
Oh, in a big way. And yeah, I'm a huge Giallo fan, as I think people know. And the New York Ripper is one of my favorite Giallo films, not just because it's unusual, because it's got an American setting. I mean, obviously, it's New York City, but stuff like that, stuff like Maniac, Manhunter, which it was a great novel. It was based on the novel Red Dragon. Far superior to Silence of the Lambs. Brian Cox's depiction of Hannibal Lecter is brilliant. Contra, Anthony Hopkins acting like some campy gay, like Liberace, but who eats people or something. But I mean that's a tangent, so please excuse that. But I think like Jack the Ripper was kind of the first. I mean, he was the first media serial killer who was really kind of transformed into a character. Everything from it Jesus, forgive me, I'm having a senior moment. Who wrote George Bernard Shaw? Yeah, George Bernard Shaw. He suggested that Jack the Ripper was implementing a eugenic policy that that was remedying the tragedy of the commons through presumably wiping out lumpens. But in terms of the more kind of pedestrian treatments of him as an archetype, I think that it's a perfect sort of stand-in for people's concept of a very personal kind of evil. Okay. A kind of like mirror of, the man's like deviant impulses, like his darker nature, not encumbered or regulated by the inner moral conscience. Mass shooters, it's two things. It doesn't really track with that sort of audience manipulation of the conceptual basis of the character's motivations and things like that. It lacks that inherent malleability into something romantic and sexy, but also the intrinsically political nature of it, of mass shooting contra serial murder. Even if the mass shooter is a complete moron in the clinical sense, even if he has a completely underdeveloped and stunted, view of political matters, like even if his stated motivation is laughable, there's an intrinsically political, or at least sociologically relevant imperative around why he does what he does. The film The Assassination of Richard Nixon with Sean Penn, it's based on the real case of Samuel Bick. Obviously Nixon wasn't assassinated, but to understand the title, you'll have to watch the movie. Bick wasn't a mass shooter, but he aspired to be, and that kind of like, it's a character study, not unlike Taxi Driver. Although Bick, who's a real guy, like he's far less of a compelling subject than Travis Bickle. But I think it's two things. Like, the subject matter is something that legacy media, and don't get me wrong, legacy media, despite barriers to entry having largely abated with respect to film production, legacy media still wields a lot of power in terms of what sees light of day on the proverbial big screen. Okay. And so I think there's a censorious prejudice against addressing the subject matter categorically. Secondly, I think viewers, it makes them feel queasy, and I think that people can easily imagine themselves being victims of a mass shooting in a public place, and that's not an unfounded fear. I mean, I don't worry about that kind of stuff, but I know a lot of people do, and that's a lot less crazy than thinking that you're going to die from COVID or the seasonal flu. So I think there's that. Um, and also, I think there's just not. I think it's a phenomenon that's somewhat ill understood. Like look at you raised the movie Elephant, which is a dope movie. I Gus Van Sant, I think, is kind of a hack filmmaker. He reminds me of Brian De Palma in a lot of ways, including the fact that Elephant is like a great movie, but most of his catalog is shit. Otherwise, just like De Palma made like masterpieces like Carlito's Way, but otherwise he made a lot of garbage. But Elephant is great because it really does get into the motivations of Klebold and Harris. And the discussion and the discourse around the Columbine when it happened, and even in decades subsequent, it was completely ridiculous. It was a lot of projection. It was a lot of grandstanding. There's a lot of just plain ignorance about kind of what animates people in post-Cold War America to carry out violent acts. There's a basic like illiteracy around it. So, the lack of intelligibility of it to the kind of self-styled intelligentsia and to these sort of media gatekeepers, who again, their power is greatly diminished. But in cinema, what remains of cinema, they still wield a lot of power, if that makes any sense.
Oh, 100%. And I, again, going back to the bizarrely sexual nature of this topic, and I'll be honest, I'm an Anglo. I don't really enjoy talking about that, but I think that there's a there's a mirror image to the male predation, which is the female obsession with that type of criminal desire. You see this in true crime podcasts, which are incredibly popular among women. I mean, true crime on network television. There's a reason that Dateline has existed effectively for my entire life and will never stop. It's an incredibly that kind of bizarre fantasy that you're talking about of, I may be abducted is more alluring than, some skinny twink may blast me away with an AR-15. In a way that's bluntly said, but you know what I mean? That there is this kind of dark fascination for women around criminal topics of that nature.
Oh no, hugely. And there's people act like it's mysterious or indecipherable why, you get ladies, who a lot of whom are admittedly unhinged, but are nevertheless, young and attractive, doing things like sending Richard Ramirez their underwear and stuff. Well, which don't get me wrong, that's like a very silly and gauche and tacky thing to do. Like, okay, like I'm not saying anything like cool about that, but that's really what women get into in terms of horny subjects, like the way some guys get into hardcore pornography. It comes from the same place. And a guy like Richard Ramirez or like Ted Bundy, ultimately, like, women want to be desired. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's totally normal, and that's God authored it that way because that's part of the whole like minuet between the sexes and how their polarity becomes reconciled. So in a very warped and violent and pathological way, a guy like Ted Bundy or like Richard Ramirez, both of whom are arguably handsome and charismatic sexually, like a woman imagining some evil guy who, when, seeing herself in his eyes as this sublime object of desire, and obviously murdering somebody is sort of like the ultimate act of dominance and possession. I mean, you understand why this tracks with the female id. And I'm not saying all women are into that. Most women are not. But the ones that are, I understand why that tracks. And yeah, the reason why true crime. I've got something of a fixation with the case histories because I was like a criminal lawyer for a time. So I will pour over the documentary record obsessively of certain kinds of criminal cases. That's a different kind of thing. But true crime is the genre where it's like these kind of lurid accounts that are heavy on direct testimony and things of these like sex fiend killers. Like, yeah, that's as much a female branded or female coded form of entertainment as like romance novels are. 100%.
I think the French term for those books is literature to be read with one hand. I'll leave there.
yeah. One-handed magazines.
So Thomas, we're fast approaching time. This was a fun conversation. If people want to find you, where can they do so?
Yeah, thank you, buddy. Yeah, check this out because like the censorship regime is hassling me again and many other people. You'll notice that the government of Yemen has basically been deplatformed, and which is ridiculous. So everybody, I mean, I'm like some nobody random guy, but however everyone feels about the government of Yemen, they are the government of a national state that America's at war with. I think it's vaguely important we would be able to access the dispatches, but I've had to reconfigure the way that we do stuff. I will always be on Substack, which is kind of my home. And I just released a documentary film that's about 90 minutes long that my dear friend Rake filmed and made possible. And that's where my podcast is. That's where a lot of my longer form writing is. We got a pretty active chat there. It's realthomas777.substack.com. I launched a Discord server this week and I got huge love for the fellas and for the females, in our faction. It's really hopping. It's not me capping to try and draw interest to it. It's really exceeded expectations. You can link to the Discord channel on the Substack. I'm on Telegram. It's the Telegram channel is Thomas777, and you can link to that through the Substack too. I'm on Instagram. And again, too, like where the media environment is very fluid right now. I shouted out a sit rep on this a couple of days ago. So that coupled with the censorship regime cracking down, where we're kind of changing the way we can figure things, but I will always be on Substack. Check the Substack regularly. And again, Discord's hopping right now. So is the Telegram. Just please stay tuned.
And again, be sure to check out Thomas and I's paywalled podcast, Radio Free Chicago. Should have a new episode up soon. That's for more current event stuff. But if you want to find The Jay Burden Show, you can do so on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can either do that directly with the links down in the description if you have some crypto to spare, or you can head over to our sponsors, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. I am hobbling around like an old man today, and you can blame JD for that. Really has a good product there. Axios is growing fast. You should get in while you still can. That is a direct threat of violence, just to be clear. But if you were looking for gear, North Appalachian Supply, they'll get you sorted away. He's one of us. Good guy, high quality products. Links in the description for both of those. Again, Thomas, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.